The United States interventions are not actually designed to help parties come together to resolve conflicts. They're actually designed to ensure conflicts persist so that the United States has a perpetual rationale to have a presence in a particular area. And then it, of course, deploys permanent military forces. It provides arms to particular sides of the equation. It threatens economic sanctions on those it doesn't like. It instigates and helps organize and fund domestic destabilization initiatives whenever it doesn't find the current regime to its liking, etc., etc. So these patterns of behavior seem to be deeply ingrained, and they're deeply ingrained and rationalized by virtue of a belief in not only the rights that come with being exceptional, but the obligations.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking again to Dr. Warwick Powell, an adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, Australia, and a senior fellow at the Beijing-based Taihe Institute. Warwick, welcome back.
Great to be back with you, Pascal.
Great to have you here again, because recently you released an article on your Substack in which you were talking about this relentless drive of the United States to conjure up, to talk about a war with China. And I think this is a really one of the most important issues of our time, because like the more time goes by, the more emails I actually get from people telling me that they are actually now afraid. Emails from Taiwan, including from former ambassadors, including from office staff who tell me, look, we can feel that it's being drummed up and we are ready to be the next Ukraine for a proxy war. Warwick, what is your assessment of the situation?
Yeah, look, the inspiration, if you will, or the catalyst for that piece that I published on Substack was the speech that US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth gave at the Singapore Shangri-La Security Forum, where he really did talk in ways that would be very hard to disguise as anything but beating the drums of war. He talked about China as a realistic and potentially an imminent threat, and the pressure was being applied to American allies across the Western Pacific or the East Asia region to step up, increase their defense spending, and to play a more active role in America's particular approach to, I guess, what they would call deterrence. The American obsessions with warfare and with this idea of peace through strength and with the pursuit of deterrence by being the biggest guy on the block has dominated thinking for at least the best part of the last 70 years in the post-World War II era. And despite the lessons of history, or what you'd think are the lessons of history, whether they are the lessons of Korea, the lessons of Vietnam, the tragedies of Indochina, let alone what's happening in Europe and other parts of the world in which the United States has instigated military interventions, the lessons don't seem to be learned, that these approaches bring nothing but death and destruction. They actually don't firstly resolve tensions that may exist, rather they exacerbate tensions. They don't create the conditions for economic development that can improve the livelihoods of people. On the reverse, they destroy economic potential and create other problems such as mass migration, which ultimately feeds into the social dislocations that we're now starting to see and the political fallout from that in the so-called developed world. So my general sense is that the United States is hell-bent on the idea that it needs to contain China as a peer threat. Why it views China as a peer threat perhaps is something that we could touch on later on, but it is hell-bent on that idea. It sees the need to hold China back as a full frontal, multi-dimensional effort on a technology front, on a PR front, propaganda war, on an economic front, particularly in relation to technologies. But you hear all the incessant talk, of course, of choke points to starve China of energy through the Straits of Malacca, etc. And of course, we have the the hottest of hot button issues, which is the resolution of the Chinese Civil War, and that, of course, is what we generally describe as the Taiwan question. The United States seems to me to want to have its cake and to eat it at the same time. It talks officially about maintaining this thing called the One China policy, but at the same time is constantly chipping away at it in practical terms, salami slicing what that policy actually means in practice and pursuing initiatives that will sustain tensions across the Taiwan Straits rather than contribute to their peaceful resolution. And we are now reaching a point where, given all the broader anxieties that the United States has in terms of changes in the world and the ordering of things, it now sees an imminent need to push China hard on this particular hot button issue. It is committing to deliver more arms to the forces or the political regime on Taiwan Island, and it is talking up the threat of war as a way of pressuring its regional allies, whether it's in the Philippines, Japan, and Australia, to boost their military defense spending and to join in with the United States on this so-called containment strategy. This means that the situation is, in a certain sense, incredibly unstable. The upside so far is that mainland China has been incredibly reticent to respond in any substantial material sense, other than through, of course, strong rhetorical responses at a diplomatic level and the continuing modernization and development of its own defense capabilities in light of 70 years of American military primacy in the region. So the United States does have an obsession, and that is uh, seeing others in the region, unsurprisingly, being prodded by the United States to pick up the cudgels and fight what seems to be America's fights.
Can you can you tell me, like, there is this common talking point in any kind of article that you read online or on paper, that when it discusses China and the threat of war with China, that always brings up the date 2027. This is a another really weird obsession, because it's being ascribed to Xi Jinping as having put that date forward, but this is an invention by an American general or admiral, and it's now almost carved in stone, as in this is the date that we prepare for. Can you talk to that?
Yeah, look, this 2027 question actually did come up from an American admiral, and Davidson, I think it is from memory. And interestingly, there seems to be a pattern in which these sorts of rhetorical devices, these ideas that get floated from the American system, end up becoming ascribed to the other party. So another recent example was this idea um, that when Russia invaded Ukraine on 24th of February 2022, that it was going to take Kiev in 3 days. And because it didn't take Kiev in 3 days, that was tantamount to chronic failure on the part of the Russian army. But of course, that 3 days timetable was something created or made up by Western observers and commentators. So the the pattern is that there are people in the West who seem to imagine things, create their own benchmarks against which they judge others' behavior against, and then, of course, use that as the rationalization for how they themselves need to respond. So this 2027 thing has been floating around now for a number of years. It has never been a date that has passed the lips of any Chinese leader. There has been no insistence that the People's Liberation Army be ready for any particular date at all. And yet, of course, it now becomes the cornerstone, as you say, of Western military buildup. It's a way of giving a focal point to people in the region that the United States believes it can cajole, encourage, or bully into joining with the United States in its campaign of continual encirclement and continual pressure on the People's Republic of China.
It's in a sense, it's like the military propagandistic version of a straw man argument, isn't it? It's like you build up, you put something that's obviously bad or stupid or whatever into the mouth of the other one, and then by talking about it, and you have what you need in order to basically attack that opponent. And if something happens, you tell everybody, look, I told you it was always the case. And if nothing happens, you declare victory. We won a fight that the other one never wanted to fight. It's like it's kind of lunacy, but it does have its very own rationale within the system, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It definitely has its own logic, right? And if you can put words into other people's mouths, respond accordingly, and when the other side doesn't behave as you said it would, it's because of what you did in response and preparations. You successfully deterred the other side. But of course, if the other side does react, you can immediately say, see, I told you so. They are always aggressive. And so you see all of this rhetoric all the time around things like how China's military modernization and expansion has been described. It's often described as the largest peacetime military buildup that we've seen since, the end of the Second World War. But of course, what that doesn't tell you is that, in fact, the United States is actually the largest so-called peacetime post-war military buildup the world has ever seen.
Except for the fact that the United States has not been at peace for like most of the last 80 years. I think not a single year.
Well, correct. And in fact, the United States, according to some American scholars, right, so this is Monica Duffy-Toft and Sadida Kushi, they published a book a couple of years ago called Dying by the Sword. And it is a review of American foreign policy, or what they call the militarization of American foreign policy, which draws on a large data set of American military interventions going all the way back to the founding of the United States. And they conclude that the United States is a country that has become, quote, addicted to military intervention, unquote, and that the data is actually very interesting because it shows that between the end of the Second World War and the end of the Cold War, so to speak, so 45, 46 through to 1990, 91, that the United States initiated 2.4 military interventions per year on average. That increased in the unipolar period, 1991 through to 2019, to 3.7 military interventions per year on average. This is a nation that has coursing through its, cultural veins, if you will, a need to instigate military actions against others. And it is a defining part, I think, certainly of elite establishment identity, and perhaps through that, also a defining part of what is actually an American identity, that the United States is a country that formulates its own sense of self and its sense of exceptionalism through the pursuit of war against others.
And this, I had Sidita Kushi on this channel about 1.5 years ago or so. If I think about it, I'll link it in the description. But the other part that's so fascinating is that I think they went in their data set all the way back to 1779 or maybe the 1780s, and they also took into account the wars between the United States and all the indigenous tribes. And even if you take all of this into consideration, the time between the 1780s and 1945 had less than half of the military interventions than post 45, and you have more interventions post 89, 90 than in the 45 to 89 period. So the whole narrative of a constantly evolving, like more peaceful relationship and drive towards, Pax Americana is such a nonsense if you
Yeah.
actually look at the data. And yet, this is what is believed. I mean, the self-image of many people in the United States, or at least what we hear, let's say from CNN and CNBC and so on, what we hear is that the United States is a peace-loving country. Just it's kind of peace-loving the way that star-crossed lovers never get to meet the other one. Why? How do you explain to yourself that this militaristic drive and this obvious militarism in the United States, where the veterans are thought of as a holy category of people, right? While then still being treated pretty poorly socially and so on, that all of that is possible while there's a general kind of belief in peace, in the state being a peaceful one.
Look, I mean, far be it for me to psychoanalyze an entire nation and its cultural history, but I think one of the interesting things about this dynamic is the way in which the United States rationalizes its military interventions, either as a normative intervention, which is we need to intervene to, in the name of, insert whatever liberal cause takes our fancy today, democracy, human rights, or whatever it happens to be. And the other one is this view that other countries and other groups of people don't have the capacity to resolve their own conflicts, and it's necessary for the United States to somehow intervene to make sure that, quote, conflicts don't get out of hand. And so the United States positions itself as a regional balancing force, so that local um, entities and groups of people, in a sense, don't get to find their own ways to resolve the issues at hand, but in the end are forced to, one side gets backed by the Americans, and so it perpetuates conflict. And we see this time and time again. And so the United States interventions are not actually designed to help parties come together to resolve conflicts. They're actually designed to ensure conflicts persist, so that the United States has a perpetual rationale to have a presence in a particular area. And then it, of course, deploys permanent military forces. It provides arms to particular sides of the equation. It threatens economic sanctions on those it doesn't like. It instigates and helps organize and fund domestic destabilization initiatives whenever it doesn't find the current regime to its liking, etc., etc. So these patterns of behavior seem to be deeply ingrained, and they're deeply ingrained and rationalized by virtue of a belief in not only the rights that come with being exceptional, but the obligations that exceptionalism brings, and they are obligations to extend exceptionalism with American characteristics to the rest of the world, and even if that means to do it violently. It's a very, look, as I said, far be it from me to psychoanalyze this, but there is something a little bit uh, uh, discombobulating, to use a bit of a mouthful of a word, about this. It's a very hard thing to understand.
Yeah, no, but and it's probably the wrong way to try to ask for like psychological explanations, because obviously a nation, especially one as large as like over 300 million people in the United States, obviously is not one character, right? And it's obviously the product of varied interactions of these different peoples, but also the institutions that they create. Absolutely, but it does raise the question: if now the analysis is that the United States is willing and able to be highly violent, because the point is that violence is a problem-solving strategy, right? You use that instead of anything else. And the point is that for the United States, it is so extremely powerful that losing a war, let's say in Ukraine or in Vietnam, you don't like it, but at the end of the day, 6 months down the road, nobody remembers that you withdrew from Afghanistan. Only a couple of, academic weirdos will still write about it. And every once in a while, you have somebody on a talk show. It doesn't matter. It doesn't touch the power elites, really. So if we take that for granted, and we also take for granted that there's a constant narrative spin about it, that tries to recast even the wildest of aggressions, let's say the Iraq War, as a war of self-defense, and therefore a white knight on a horse coming to rescue poor Iraqis, even if 20 years later they're still under the boot. We take all of this. How do responsible nations, the others in the world, react to that? China, Russia, but also a Japan, and so on, taking into consideration that if that a war in and about the island of Taiwan might be exactly what Washington people are planning and want. So how do you prevent that from happening, or how do we prevent that from happening in that constellation?
Yeah, look, great questions, Pascal. And I think one of the things that we do see across the board is actually an incredible amount of restraint from other large nations in the face of this sort of belligerence from the United States. Of course, patience can run out, and that's when we enter into extremely dangerous moments, particularly when the Americans, and as we saw that with Pete Hegseth, but also in more recent pronouncements on the economic front, technology fronts, and other dimensions, seems to persist in this sense that they need to mount an all-out war against China to a point where they want to push it all the way to the edge. Now, I think that there is something that might hold some of this back. The United States does, of course, possess a very large stockpile of nuclear weapons, but we are now talking about the prospects of direct conflict between more than one nuclear power. We know that the war in Ukraine is actually a war between Russia, the United States, the collective West, in which Ukraine is the provider of the human resource base and the provider of the territory. But nobody, and in particularly those in Moscow, have explicitly called this out because they know that to do so, in a sense, triggers the de jure recognition that this is actually a war between the United States and Russia. And that is, of course, very, very dangerous. Whilst everybody can kind of pretend that it's not really directly a war between Russia and the United States, then restrained behavior appropriate to the context can be, in a sense, prosecuted as part of this conflict. And I think a similar situation is conceivable in the Asia theatre as well. And that perhaps explains why the United States is encouraging its non-nuclear partners in the region to step up to the plate as a way by which it can push those non-nuclear allies into the fray and stay one step back, therefore not triggering something more catastrophic and dangerous. And I think because of that, and if we calculate, and these are only calculations around behavioral probabilities, but if we calculate that the United States is ultimately reluctant to enter into direct conflict with a peer adversary, particularly a nuclear one, then, and this is what my article tries to do, which is just to explore some scenarios, or at least one core scenario, which is actually not war at all, but a very different response. So the United States assumes that everybody will behave like it will. Okay, and you see that in various intellectual discourses about China, that China will behave like America, and therefore we must. This goes back to that what we were talking about earlier, which is therefore we must prepare in a certain way. So the expectation is that if we can provoke China enough, maybe it'll fire the first shot. But what if China doesn't fire a shot at all? What if China actually approaches the question of Taiwan on the basis that Taiwan Island is part of China's sovereign territory, and it doesn't need to invade this island, it simply needs to protect it. And if it does that, and it says, well, look, we're concerned, we've reached a point where we are concerned that our sovereignty is being jeopardized in a potentially permanent way through the interference of external parties, such as the provision of arms and other forms of support, then it becomes necessary for the People's Republic of China to establish a defensive cordon around the island to protect its territory. Now, of course, in doing so, we know through the exercises that have taken place over the last few years that such a defensive cordon could be established actually very, very quickly. Definitely within 24 hours, and more likely between 6 and 12 hours. And a no-fly zone and a naval non-interdiction zone could be declared for anything but civilian traffic. Now, if that happens, the question then is how does the United States respond? But in leading up to that, and this is where I think the issue of restraint and modes of international discourse and conduct will sort of play a bit of a role here, is that it's likely that China would, of course, continue to protest to the United States about the provision of arms to Taiwan, the watering down of the One China policy, the salami slicing, if you will, the attempts to undermine the credibility of United Nations resolutions from the 1970s, and all of those things which have been the bedrock of the political détente between the United States and People's Republic of China have all been slowly but surely sliced and diced. And so the first thing would be to continue making those sorts of protests. But I think those protests could step up a notch and see a direct demand, a démarche, a very serious protest lodged, which is essentially demanding that the United States ceases and desists from providing arms to the forces in Taipei, and perhaps even goes further than that, which will be to demand that American troops that are on the island are withdrawn permanently, and that, and of course, given past form, I would expect the United States to just ignore all of that, like it did when the Russians in late 2021, put some serious propositions on the table. China would then, I think, well, here's the scenario. It's not a prediction, but I'm just sort of thinking through what something could happen. Would then raise exactly the same issues at the Security Council, and of course, it will invite, in effect, the United States to veto any resolutions that call on the United States to cease and desist in interfering in China's domestic affairs, in destabilizing another nation's sovereignty, etc., etc. And once all that's said and done, and the United States vetoes that again, then I think China could use that to justify the rapid creation of the defensive cordon that I touched on before, which is quite clearly the United States has indicated its intentions to continue to supply arms and to interfere in national sovereign questions. Now, that, of course, will bring things to a crisis point, because whilst de jure Taiwan is recognized as part of One China, what are other nations going to do? So other nations would be forced to contemplate abandoning the One China policy. But can they do that whilst Taipei itself has not abandoned the One China policy? Should Taipei move to abandon the One China policy, that would trigger the civil war to be reenacted or to be activated again. Because let's not forget, the civil war is not over. There is no armistice. There is no peace treaty. There's just been this détente. But it isn't over. And so if there is a move to formally declare Taiwanese independence, then let there be no doubt that the People's Republic of China will move assertively.
When in conflict prevention or conflict management, also on an interpersonal level, one of the methods or strategies to defuse, especially the most dramatic moments, when passion takes over. One of the strategies can be to confuse, not confuse in the sense of obfuscate, but in the sense of doing something that seriously the other party didn't expect. If you get into a fist fight or about to get into a fist fight, if one of the two sides starts crying and says like my mother just died, that would immediately create an emotional response in the other one and might actually be able to change the situation. And I keep wondering if there are equivalents to that, something that China could do that is so unexpected that it would change the dynamics. Something like a proposal, saying publicly, and I know that this will probably not happen, but something like publicly saying, how about a meeting between Xi Jinping and Lai Ching-te? Just like, on TV, something that nobody would expect, and then see what comes out of that.
Yeah, as you say, look, those sorts of initiatives with uncertain outcomes are probably less likely to happen in this particular context. But I think one of the things is, should there be a defensive cordon established, as I described, it's likely to trigger a considerable amount of political uncertainty on the island itself. And that will perhaps function as the out of the blue catalyst to punching through, if you will, the current unstable status quo. And I mean by that the possibility that the military, in this case, on the island, could respond in the event that the political or the politicians are unable to. There is no overwhelming desire on the island for independence, because I think many people understand the risks that that brings. At the same time, of course, there is definitely no overwhelming desire amongst island populations for reunification. Most people would just like to get on with their lives and have the status quo, kick the can down the road, as they say. It's always easier to not deal with a big problem today if you can push it off into the future. But in the event that something like this happens, then the problem needs to be dealt with, and it could trigger a political crisis on the island that could see the reimposition, temporarily at least, of martial law, and the military moving in to more or less say, enough's enough. We've got to sort out this civil war problem, because if we don't, then we're not going to be able to get through this particular impasse. And phone calls could conceivably start taking place quite rapidly between, certainly at a military to military level to start with, to provide assurances that there won't be any attacks on the island, provided that the island doesn't run off and declare independence and all those sorts of things. And that could create the space in which a conference could be held. And that conference would then focus on what a reunified China looks like, recognizing realities. And that, in a sense, would be a constructive outcome in the event that these events, push down this particular path. The other thing to remember, Pascal, is the Taiwan question is also a regional question, in the sense that it can trigger a whole range of other concerns and destabilizations, or certainly catalyze change in the security architecture of the region. And I mentioned in my article the 1961 treaty between the DPRK and the People's Republic of China, which would actually oblige the DPRK to enter into the fray should the island of Taiwan or People's Liberation Naval Forces or whatever, should they be attacked by third parties, because that is an attack on Chinese sovereignty. Now, I don't think anybody wants to trigger the DPRK's involvement in anything in the region, because that brings with it another layer of not just complexity, but incredible uncertainty. And of course, if you trigger the DPRK's involvement, you then potentially also trigger at least some more heightened interest from Moscow, given the agreements that were entered into last year. And so now what you do, if you, meaning, the Western, the collective West, if they're not careful, they will actually activate the People's Republic of China, the DPRK, and Russia as three nuclear forces in this region. Now, South Korea and Japan are not likely to want to trigger any of that. And it wouldn't surprise me if, as the region confronts this possibility, that the backdoor diplomacy between Seoul, Tokyo, and Beijing doesn't go into absolute overdrive, where there would be serious discussions being entertained about what a settlement of the island question will look like, but also what that will ultimately mean in terms of America's presence in the region as well. And I think this is America's greatest anxiety. This issue of Taiwan is in many ways emblematic of America's last major, serious foothold in the region. Of course, it's got bases in other places, but in fact, for the Taiwan question to be resolved and resolved in the favor of reunification, and for that to happen in a non-violent way, would be a devastating blow, actually, to American primacy ambitions in Asia.
Yes, it would, because it mainly would undermine its core narrative about itself, and it would undermine its entire credibility towards its other two allies, Japan and South Korea, of course. But it is a powder keg. You're absolutely right. And my issue is that also, as you pointed out in your article, the this drive to use violence, to use military means to resolve issues is so deeply ingrained that those tripwires that have been created and the mechanisms that are in place, I see the United States is willing to use them pretty quickly. And let's go back to the DPRK. If anything with the DPRK and South Korea happens, anything, then the high command of the combined forces will be assumed by a U.S. four-star general. The entire South Korean military force will be under the command of a U.S. four-star general. And this is just an incredible kind of setup that the United States still has going, and that I do think people are contemplating in Washington of how to use most skillfully, because millions of people dying is just not a restraining factor to the psychopaths that we are talking about. They're obviously a big issue to 99.9% of people over here and anywhere, but not to certain of these military planners. So again, the diffusing of the situation is an imperative over here, and in a sense, defeating U.S. war hawks would mean to figure out a way not to go to war, which is a next level problem.
Well, interestingly, when you describe it like that, what that actually paints is a picture where the interests of the DPRK, Japan, the Republic of Korea, and China are actually entirely aligned, and that creates an environment in which a new set of security architectures could actually be conceived. Now, for that to happen, of course, it will need to see the question of Taiwan Island brought to the table to be resolved, and it will need to be resolved, of course, between the island and the mainland. It is, after all, a domestic question, unless the Americans want to say that it's not. I can't see the Americans doing that, to be honest with you, notwithstanding the psychopaths that exist, in large part because, and it goes back to my comment earlier, and that is that the United States whilst it can throw other people's sons and husbands into war, it's happy to. Whilst it can have other places destroyed, it's more than happy to see that happen. What it doesn't want to do is entertain the risk that the United States homeland actually becomes a target. And the reality is, and this is why I think the Ukraine war has, in a sense, unfolded the way that it has, is because the military planners know that mainland United States could become a target, And if they do the same in the Taiwan area or do the same in relation to the DPRK, the same thing could happen. There isn't an American that will put Washington, Detroit, Boston, Los Angeles, New York at risk to defend the island. The real issue then becomes how do they maintain as much instability as they can without going to that particular point. So the United States' interest in the region is to maintain instability. Whereas, in fact, the interests of Japan and the Koreas and China is to resolve this. And perhaps there is a catalytic moment in which those interests could actually be activated.
We had the one of the greatest successes of the Cold War in terms of diplomacy was the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the CSCE. And that process took 5 years, started in 1970, ended in 75 with the signatures of all of these foreign ministers and heads of states. It was fantastic. And the way it came about is because the Soviets told the Finns, please, you guys pitch the idea. Because if we pitch the idea, the other side will obviously say no. But if you pitch it from your side and you just write these letters to all of these ministries, and you also talk about that in the publicly, then they have to respond to you. So I wonder if a Helsinki of East Asia would be possible. Let's say through somebody's in as suspicious as Mongolia. If Ulaanbaatar sent letters to everybody, including Taipei and Beijing, said let's have a little conference or something, it would take forever. But something like this, a third party that could enter itself, but I don't see anyone willing to do that because it's a big risk.
Look, sometimes to bring peace requires the willingness to grasp the moment and to recognize that whilst there are risks involved, the risks is actually simply the failure of talks as opposed to necessarily triggering conflict per se. And so there may be some reputational risks if you stick your neck out and the idea, doesn't float. But with sufficient, backdoor or back channel diplomacy, I think it is conceivable that something like this could emerge perhaps on the sidelines of a Bandung conference, or on the sidelines of a future ASEAN +3 conference, things like that, where there's no formal endorsement per se, but an idea can then gain traction, particularly at that that track 2 level, and allow it to percolate. For it to be fleshed out a little bit by parties and make those incremental steps forward. The greatest danger to all of that, of course, is that there is actually one party whose interests aren't served by this. And again, I come back to the United States having a powerful vested interest in maintaining instability.
Yeah.
But look, one of the reasons why perhaps something like that has never happened in East Asia is because there has not been a change in the balance of power in the way that now exists. The United States could, in times past, just stomp its foot on any idea like that, and it would go nowhere. It's not so easy for the United States to do that anymore. And we've seen this in other arenas, of course, with the current tariffs situation, for example, where unilateral action from Washington actually just doesn't deliver the kind of obedient reactions across the globe that perhaps 20 or 30 years ago it would have. And I would expect that something quite similar could happen in this region. And the idea of a third party being the proponent of a conference would help all the major parties approach it without anyone thinking that there is a risk of national humiliation, which nobody wants.
To which level? I mean, the PRC and the People's Republic of China, the Republic of China, so Taiwan, and Taipei and Beijing, they have contacts. This is this cross-strait. They have offices, right? But they have been relatively quiet. I mean, diplomatically, they've been dysfunctional for years now. To what level would both the PRC and the ROC accept the other one being invited to the same event. Let's say Ulaanbaatar said like, okay, we will try this. If you invite like, you know, the foreign minister level, they would obviously say no, we won't participate in this. But at what level would an actual dialogue be acceptable to both?
Look, dialogues do happen, and there have been many and consistent dialogues, between researchers and academics and analysts, for example. And obviously, there continues to be interactions at an economic and at a family level, even if the travel has been a little bit difficult. So, um, look, I don't know where that specific level goes. You know, if you move the rankings up, but there will be a level at which a set of secondary level or tier two level dialogues could be encouraged to take place, and which could take place, that both parties could walk away from, if you will, without there being, lasting implications for their starting positions, but nonetheless gets them to a point where some ideas around what a reunification could look like could be percolated. And again, this goes to the question of in whose interests does a peaceful reunification serve, and in whose interest they don't. Let's accept that not everybody wants reunification, meaning that there are going to be some people who live on Taiwan Island who don't support it. Let's accept also that the majority of people would rather things just go the way that they are. But when push comes to shove, my gut feeling is that most of those people who would prefer the status quo would also be very reluctant to support independence, knowing the risks that that brings, which means that there will be a reluctance, but nonetheless a pragmatic realization that some form of permanent peace settlement and détente needs to be arrived at. And something more than a modus vivendi. It's not just about coming to a set of arrangements that two parties don't like each other can live with, but it's got to go beyond that as a permanent resolution to the civil war. And there are many levels at which this works. Obviously, people who live on the island will be looking for an ability to continue their lives with as minimal a set of disruptions as possible. The idea of one country, two systems gets floated. And of course, the counter argument to that is particularly those who are hostile to that idea. They'll talk about, they'll use Hong Kong as an example. But interestingly, nobody ever talks about the success of Macau as a one country, two systems process. So the Hong Kong situation was really stirred up in the lead up to the election before last, when Lai Ching-te's predecessor was actually behind in the polls, and she was able to exploit the Hong Kong situation to considerable electoral advantage on the island. So I think that this issue of one country, two systems will necessarily be part of discussions. Clearly, Beijing has a level of conceptual comfort with the idea that different rules and different laws apply in different parts of China. So not only do we have Hong Kong and Macau as distinct administrative jurisdictions, but there are also a whole range of semi-autonomous regions and autonomous regions in the mainland itself that are governed quite autonomously, whether it's and they're mainly in the west and the southwest, incidentally. So the idea, I think, of one country, many systems, is philosophically or in principle an acceptable framework. The issue then will be the detail, right? And if you can get people to begin to talk about the detail and agree on the principle, then I think you've made a lot of headway. I mean, clearly one of the issues that will ultimately need to become one country, one system is going to relate to foreign affairs and defence. And so there will need to be pathways towards the integration of the existing forces and materiel and personnel and doctrine that has operated with the Republic of China military um, and that of the People's Liberation Army. But they're sort of like merger problems, right? They're practical problems that I think military people are very sort of capable of dealing with. They'll approach it much more as an engineering problem as opposed to a philosophy problem.
Yeah. Precisely. Like some of these, some of these issues are purely intellectual. I mean, do you have any, since we are seeing the strengthening of China and its new role in the multipolar system, do you think that we will see new or like traditional Chinese approaches to international relations to come up? I mean, one of the concepts that you find in IR, especially of the last 200-300 years, that went away, but that once was important, was the idea of suzerainty. Not sovereignty, but suzerainty, right? Where the demarcation between what is under my direct control and what is the other are blurred and fizzle out. And that was kind of done away with because the current UN Charter systems and so on that we've got is one built on hard borders. But could that suzerainty issue, that suzerainty approach come back and help diffuse such situations?
Look, again, I think those general ideas, particularly when you operationalize them, are likely to be the ones that will have the best chances of enabling parties that are currently in dispute over the hard questions, the black and white questions of sovereignty to actually achieve practical détente, right? Because if you lump everything into a question of sovereignty, then of course that becomes life and death. But if in fact you start to tease out of this question of sovereignty all the different layers and components of what that actually entails, education systems, writing systems, the applications of particular laws, the way that you deal with, disputes, etc., etc. Once you start to tease all those things out, and you can deliver practical autonomy at different levels of operational implementation, then the question of sovereignty becomes less intensive. It is less a question of life and death because in many ways you can get on with your life, knowing that in your particular area of interest, which is where you live and the communities and the institutions around you, they will be what they are, and they are what they have been for the last so many generations that you've become accustomed to. Inevitably, of course, things change. And this is where I think the West has particularly honed in on in relation to Hong Kong, after the sign over in 97, with a 50-year grace period, so to speak. There have been a lot of claims, particularly coming from the UK, that the Chinese side has not lived up to the original bargain. Now, that's debatable, but the world never locks in stone, right? So you can't time freeze these places, which means that eventually what a settlement in practice looks like, say in 2030, for sake of argument, what that eventually looks like in 2050 are likely to be somewhat different. And they will evolve through, ongoing interactions of people. Sometimes they will involve disagreements about things, but often they will involve the practical sort of translation of intention that underpinned the original resolution of the problem with how it actually materializes on the ground. So, as you know, when parties in a dispute finally reach an agreement, it nonetheless takes some time afterwards to figure out what it means in practice. And those sorts of things, I think, are quite likely. But again, they're going to be practical. They're not going to be things that will trigger warfare, because the question that animates the civil war is the question of sovereignty. But once that question is resolved in an acceptable way all round, then the rest of the issues are sort of typing and engineering questions and administrative ones.
Yeah, because most of the other questions have already been resolved. I mean, de facto, there is flourishing trade between all parties. There's exchange. There's people like crossing the border. There's families reunited and so on. There's practically this problem on the ground is solved. Where it's not solved is on the theoretical level, on the existential one. There once was this idea by Liu Xulien, former vice president of the Republic of China during the 2000 to 2008. She had once the idea to declare Taiwan not as sovereign, but as a neutral island. Would a concept like that on the surface might sound like sovereignty, but has nothing to do with it, in fact, could something like this act as a way to diffuse the situation with the Republic of China?
I suspect not, because it will be likely to be seen, particularly from Beijing's point of view, as a thin end of the wedge. The idea of the island being neutral may play out at an operational level, but it can't precede the question of resolving sovereignty, is my own instinct. What it then functions like in terms of it being a territory, well, that's a separate question, right? But the first issue, the first order question, is putting to bed the civil war, which really means the cessation of the Republic of China's claims to sovereignty to China, and an acceptance that that period of Chinese history is now at a conclusion. So the end of the Civil War saw the vast majority of the territory of China come under the jurisdiction of the People's Republic of China. Some parts didn't, and they haven't been for a long time. But I think resolving that question, obviously, you can't resolve that without tackling these practical issues, because they're the ones that ultimately concern people. It's what happens tomorrow. Who's responsible for the police? Who runs the water systems, the electricity systems? Who's responsible for the roads? Who collects taxes? Who do I pay fines to? How are laws changed? How are laws introduced? And they're going to be the issues that, and the extent to which, what issues can Beijing play the determinative role on, and what issues does Beijing play the second or the subsidiary role on, and what are the triggers, for instance, for Beijing to move from being the subordinate or the passive role to being the active role. The security laws in Hong Kong is a classic case in point. The need for the Hong Kong LegCo to pass national security laws was actually part and parcel of the original agreement. And the LegCo tried to do it once, and through a whole bunch of localized political opposition, arguably aided and abetted by others, the LegCo backed off. And that was a couple of decades ago. And then, of course, we had a second attempt, which triggered the more recent events. But that was an example where Beijing really waited 20 years before insisting that something be done. And we've seen that, Beijing's patience on many things. I mean, I dare say that the question of the island of Taiwan is one of those, but there are many other issues where Beijing's patience has been, it's almost never ending, much to the frustration of many people. But it seems to accept that forcing things sometimes is counterproductive, and you need to be willing to let time work its thing, and for the conditions to be right for the pieces to fall into place. And maybe this is some of the ideas, the non-Western ideas around international relations too, Pascal, where we need to supplement the sort of the black and white relationships that are carved into the UN Charter with some of these other more grey concepts, whether they're suzerainty or whatever, to enable conditions to be created that allow peoples to interact with each other in stable ways that don't compromise the other issues, right? And if we can do that, and that's why I decided to explore this one scenario, which is, well, instead of there being this invasion, which the Americans always keep talking about, what if we actually saw the island of Taiwan from Beijing's point of view, which is, well, it's actually part of national sovereignty, and so we need to defend it. We've got no interest in sending troops and bombing the island, none. What we do have an interest in is in reducing the extent to which third parties can interfere in it. And if they did that, it's likely to catalyze, I think, incredible changes in the regional security architecture. Um, where that goes, of course, will depend on how the United States reacts, of course. But it will also depend on whether or not Japan and Korea ultimately sees this as a window of opportunity to reshape not only their own relationships with the United States, but to reshape their role within regional security, which I think could be done in a way that is of benefit to both Japan and the Republic of Korea.
I think so too. I agree with that very much. There's a lot to be gained from a common approach that is not a US-driven confrontation. Warwick Powell, this was a very interesting discussion. I will put the link to your essay and everything into the description. Is there anywhere else except for Substack where people should find you?
Look, that's probably the best place at this stage, and I'll update things on Substack quite regularly. And if people are interested, they can follow me there.
I'll put the link down there. Warwick Powell, thank you very much for your time today.
Great to be back with you.